Thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Welcome to the program. My guest is Thomas Patterson. He's the Bradley Professor of Government and the Press at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's the author of many amazing and excellent books, particularly on media and communication. The book today we're talking about is the Republican Party Destroying Itself? Thomas, thanks for joining me this afternoon.
Charles, thank you.
You know, right off the bat, you put forth a very interesting premise in the first chapter when you talked about, in a sense, the balance between the two major parties and how that's a historic phenomena, and that the Democratic Party representing progress, the Republican Party representing constancy, and how each of the parties tend to balance the rough edges of the other, which is perhaps why the two-party system works when both parties are true to their mission, and yet you talk about the Republican Party going off the mission, so to speak. So let's start there.
Well, we do have a two-party system, and a characteristic of a two-party system is that you tend to kind of go toward the center in a two-party system. That neither party by itself can win elections. So it needs those moderates, those independents, those swing voters in order, at least consistently over the long run, to be able to be competitive. That tends to moderate the parties. It tends to make them kind of willing to compromise, willing to accommodate. That's the natural dynamic of a two-party system. But the Republican Party, for about the last 40 years, has been veering to the right. We haven't seen this before in our two-party system, where a party has kind of progressively moved toward the wing and away from the middle. Part of my argument is that in a two-party system, that's a losing strategy. Now, there were reasons why the Republican Party moved in that direction. If you look at the New Deal era, roughly 1930s through most of the 1960s, Republicans were getting beat regularly by Democrats, and they decided they need to reposition the party. And it started with Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, an attempt to embrace white racial conservatives in the South. Quite successfully, they moved over almost immediately in presidential elections. It took a little while at the congressional level, moved almost immediately in presidential races into the Republican column. And all of a sudden, the Republican Party was competitive again. And they've been quite competitive ever since. But I think the long-term trends for the party are really quite dismal. And it's heading for a cliff. And that cliff is an ideological cliff. It's a demographic cliff. I think there are 5 traps that the Republican Party has put itself in.
Mm-hmm. Now, you talk about the Republican Party moving to the right, and I think that's true. I think it started probably with Goldwater, and I think the culmination of it was Reagan, and it has continued to do that. I would also suggest that the Democratic Party has moved further to the left, starting with FDR, and its kind of bigger government, more direct authority over more areas of life. And that today it's moving even further to the left. So I think that there's the poles are shifting on the playing field, and that each side is moving away from the other and away from the center. There's like a pull away.
No, I think you have a good point, Charles. I would modify it a little bit. I think you're absolutely right about the transformation that occurred within the Democratic Party in the 1930s. Before then, it had been largely a states' rights party with its base in the South. And then the Northern liberals in the 1930s captured the party, and suddenly it was a party of the national government using national power for economic, social, political purposes. But that move, I think, took place in the 1930s, and it pretty well solidified itself. Now, of course, you had the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, which pushed the party further to the left. But then if you look at the party since then, most of what it's done is actually try to protect its legacy, try to protect all those programs that were put in place through the New Deal, through the Great Society. And there's only really one substantial program in all of that period since the 1960s that the Democrats have put in place, and that's the Affordable Care Act. So,
Right.
yeah, they are left, but they haven't moved very much since the 60s. The Republican Party, on the other hand, has moved strongly to the right since then. And I would agree with you. It started with Nixon and the Southern Strategy, accelerated in the 1970s around the cultural issues that arose around abortion and the like, and the Republican Party's embrace of white evangelicals. That's a very conservative group, and then Reagan with his small government, anti-welfare sentiment in the 80s. I think that solidified the ideology. And what's interesting about that change is that it was a complete reversal from Republican history. Under Abraham Lincoln and for 100 years, the Republican Party was the federal party. And within a short span of about 2 decades, you look at the Reagan presidency and it's the states' rights party now. And then Newt Gingrich comes along, does a lot to purge moderates from the party. The Tea Party movement further purged moderates. The Tea Party, some of your listeners may remember, mounted challenges to moderate Republicans.
Yeah,
in the
remember that.
2010 Republican primaries and beat quite a number of them. And that moved the party further to the right. And then Donald Trump. Now, his version of right's a little bit different than some of the other before him, but it would be hard to describe Donald Trump as anything but a right-wing politician.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on how you define left and right. And the main element that I see you using to define the right is race, that the right has something against Black people. And I mean, I just think that, yes, that's there, I suppose, but I would argue that it's a little broader than that. I mean, it has more to do with this idea, and Trump, I think, expressed it well in his inaugural speech. The kind of the return. I mean, he ran against both Democrats and Republicans in many ways. The return of, I mean, in a way, it was very much like Andrew Jackson almost. I mean, kind of the return of governing responsibility to the people and removing it from this kind of entrenched both Democrat and Republican establishment. I mean, he was the anti-establishment party. Now, whether or not he actually is another question, but that was the movement. That's what he ran on. And I think some of his opponents really don't understand that element.
Oh, I take your point. I would say, though, that if you look at the history of the Republican Party and after World War II, a lot of the internationalists were in the Republican Party.
Right.
And up until Donald Trump's presidency.
Although Robert Taft was not.
Taft was not, but
Eisenhower was. But Eisenhower was almost like a bridge figure. I mean, he was both. He could have been either a Democrat or a Republican. I mean, I think he was a conservative in the broad sense, but he was definitely an internationalist.
He was an internationalist. He actually damped down a fight that Taft wanted to have within the Republican Party about going back and refighting the New Deal. And Eisenhower basically said, "You're crazy."
Right.
People accept Social Security. They accept the minimum wage. They accept collective bargaining. And if we go down that route, if we look back 20 years, 30 years, you're not going to hear from this party again. So
sure.
He came out, I think he came, you're quite right. I mean, he's a very interesting character because, his roots are in the conservative area of the Republican Party. And the progressive wing was concentrated on the East Coast and in the upper Midwest. So he didn't grow up with progressive Republican politics, but he was part of that wing of the party when he governed. And there were a lot of internationalists in that. But then if you look also at free trade and kind of the winds of change that began in the 1980s, the movement toward free trade, that came primarily from the Republican leadership, not from the Democratic side. And,
interesting.
And up until Trump, if you looked at the Republican Congress, for example, we had three free trade agreements that were passed in 2011, one with Korea, one with Colombia, and one with Panama. Republican lawmakers voted, over 90% of them voted for those free trade agreements, and the support for it was much less within the Democratic Party. So I would argue that, yes, he's speaking to kind of a dimension of the Republican Party, but it was the smaller piece of that party after the Second War. So I think he's taking it back. In some ways, he'd like to take America back about 30 or 40 years, kind of recalibrate, and recreate that society. That's not quite the way society works. It moves on, it moves forward. But but for the most part, he's governed to the right. And I would argue with you, I think, about whether it's just about race within the Republican Party. I think there's a cultural conservative dimension to that party that's somewhat separate from race. And we saw that reaction yesterday in the embrace of the two Supreme Court decisions that came down about religious freedom.
Yes.
And then the small government argument of Ronald Reagan. That's an important part of the.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you for mentioning that, because I do think that those are things that Trump has stood for. He always stood for, the idea of protecting religious freedom. The institutions of things like Social Security, Medicare, those go back, as you say, to the New Deal or to the Great Society, and they're kind of, at this point, grandfathered in. We're never going to get rid of that. No one claims we would, any more than we'll ever get rid of the IRS or the Federal Reserve. I mean, these were progressive ideas that were put in place under great controversy and acrimony, but nevertheless, they're functioning fine, and they're part of our system. But I think that with Republicans, they want to go back to their original mission a little bit more. They want to reform some of the excesses and some of the corruption, whereas on the Democrat side, they want to expand these programs to make them bigger and more unwieldy. And I would even say the same thing with the Affordable Care Act. It's not that they want to get rid of it, but they want to rein it in so that it protects basically that small sector that Barack Obama talked about, which were people that were not insured or were uninsurable, as opposed to everyone else, which would then be able to continue to conduct their insurance. But you talk about the international trade piece here. And I think that Trump did run on this issue of getting rid of these big multinational agreements like NAFTA and the GATT agreement and the TPP, as opposed to what actually during the FDR administration was more the current, which was bilateral trade agreements with escape clauses with nations. And I think he wants to return to that. And also he wants to de-escalate America's, and this is the international piece, de-escalate foreign wars, bring troops home, cut back on American overseas expenditures, ask foreign nations to help start to pay for their own defense, particularly in NATO. And those actually were ideas that used to be liberal. They used to be democratic. Now it's Trump championing those things, did so during his campaign, and has made good on it, or has tried to. And he's being attacked by the left and by Democrats for doing this.
Well, not so much on those grounds, though. I think you're right. I mean, that part of Trump's agenda very much overlaps with what Democrats have been arguing for some time, the need to pull back from these foreign wars. One difference, I think, between Trump and most Democratic lawmakers is that Trump did champion a large increase in military spending.
Right, that's true.
That did not get much support from Democrats in the Congress. So congressional Democrats have been largely opposed to these wars of choice and have been largely supportive of cuts in defense spending. Whereas Trump comes along and he's got half of that. He doesn't have both pieces of it.
That's true, and that's a fair statement. He has increased defense spending. The second trap that you mentioned is, I think, unfortunately, from my perspective, very true and very sad, I think, and that is that the millennials, the younger demographic, are trending toward the Democratic Party. I think that every Republican coming down the pike, going back to the probably Eisenhower, I don't remember if that happened to him, but they are demonized as being racists, having something against black people, having something against minorities. And this kind of rhetoric has really ramped up against Trump. And I think that younger people are believing this. Now, I'm not suggesting that there isn't some of that there, but I think that the bigger piece of that is a creation of the liberal media and liberal enemies of Trump, particularly, but conservatism generally. And they're doing, it's a drumbeat that is taking hold among younger people who almost accept this idea as if it's gospel. And to my way of thinking, it's very divisive and it's wrong.
Well, I think if you go back and you look at the Eisenhower presidency, Eisenhower actually, according to the polls, had a lot of support from younger adults, and so did Ronald Reagan, by the way.
Sure.
Yeah, most young adults supported Ronald Reagan. The shift away from the Republican Party occurred before Trump. It started in 2004. I think in large part as a backlash to Bush's decision to invade Iraq. That gap, the age gap opened up at that point. And then it widened with Barack Obama's, both of his candidacies. And they voted very strongly for Hillary Clinton also in 2016. So this predates Donald Trump. And the point I would make about this tendency is starting in 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, that's 4 consecutive elections in a row. And if the polls today are anything close to what's going to happen in November, it will be 5. Trump's going to lose the youth vote by a large amount. Now that will be everybody under the age of 45 in the United States. And what we know from the surveys that have been done is that there's this kind of myth that people kind of grow more conservative as they age.
Right.
That sometimes happens, but it's conditioned by the times and what the nature of the times is. And actually, these voters have become more democratic as they've aged, and they also vote more regularly. And we know that happens as you get a little bit older. You're more likely to go to the polls more often. So this, to me, is a Republican horror story. And we've not seen anything like this in the last century, since the 1932, 1936, and 1940 elections, when young voters voted about 2-to-1 in favor of the Democrats. This was the heyday of the New Deal. Those 3 cohort groups, those people who came of age in those elections, they stayed with the Democratic Party loyally through the 1960s. They really were the backbone. They were the ones that delivered victory after victory in elections to the Democratic Party. And if you look down the road, unless something happens that's going to disrupt this pattern, Republican vote is coming largely from seniors, and they're not going to hang around forever. And young voters are the future voters, and it's just a horror story to me for the Republican Party.
No, as I said, you're right. I mean, it's troubling to me as someone who is in the Republican Party, but I'm wondering why. I mean, what is it about this? I mean, after all, President Trump has supported policies that help create employment and jobs. He's cut tax. He's retained. He kept the line on taxes. I wouldn't say cut taxes, but he's reduced onerous regulation. He's engaged in trade agreements that help protect labor and industry in the United States and domestically. And the result has been a great improvement in the economy. I mean, we could talk about whether or not he deserves all the credit for that, but every president under their watch takes credit for improvements in economies. And I would argue that his policies have helped. Then why is it that younger people who are entering the job market and who are graduating college with college debt and who are looking at professions, why wouldn't they, why would they not support Republicans?
Well, I think there is, they're like all voters, Charles. I mean, they have mixed feelings, right? There's some things they like about the Republican Party and some things they like about the Democratic Party. And you're quite right on some of the economic issues. They like what Republicans are proposing and what Republicans have done. But then there's a range of issues that they're not happy with the Republican Party. And I think a lot of that is around culture and some of the attacks on immigration that have worked their way into the Republican Party. One thing that it's easy to overlook is that, when you and I were growing up, probably 80% of the young people were white. Today, about half of the people under 30 years of age are minorities. So this is not the same young people of the 1960s. And, I think minorities have felt under siege by Donald Trump. And they reacted very strongly against Trump for what he's done with DACA, the border wall, very unpopular with immigrants, the raids and all of that. So I think he's been very clumsy, to be honest with you, on the immigration issue. And it doesn't help when he demonizes a group. When he calls Mexicans rapists, criminals, and so on. We've got a lot of Mexican Americans in this country, and they don't distinguish very much between a Mexican and a Mexican American. They think he's talking about them. And I think he's very much damaged the brand with Hispanics. And to me, the most interesting group, actually, of the ethnic groups are Asian Americans, not Hispanics. So they don't get a lot of attention, but they are America's fastest growing ethnic group. If you look at their profile, you'd say, oh boy, this is a Republican bloc. This is a Republican constituency right down the line. The highest average family income in America is not held by non-Hispanic whites. Asian American families have the highest average annual income. And they're twice as likely as other Americans to own small businesses. And Republicans once owned small business people. And actually, they once owned this voting group. In the 92 election, the George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton election, Asian Americans voted 2-1 Republican.
Right. Mm-hmm.
In 2016, they voted 2-1 Democratic. And that's a reaction against what they see as the Republicans' hostility to recent immigrant groups. And they are. A high percentage of them are either first or second generation Americans.
Well, I mean, I don't think that the Republicans or Trump are hostile toward recent immigrant groups. They might be hostile toward illegal immigrant groups. And that's an issue that both Clinton and Obama also railed about as well, and often. I think the difference is that Trump means it when he talks about this. And he's handled it clumsily, but I think that people are more concerned, I would hope they'd be more concerned with what's happening with the Black community in the United States and the rise of crime in their neighborhoods and the unemployment and the bad policies that have hurt the community than they are with someone trying to come across the border illegally. But the rhetoric, I think, again, he's not, he could be rude and he could be crude, of course, and that hurts him usually. But the whole thing, I think, is magnified by his enemies for political reasons, that they want to portray him as having something against people based upon their ethnic background, which is, I think, completely untrue. And yet, it's obviously been successful, which leads me to my third trap that you mentioned, and that is the media, which you talk about as the conservative media, as being damaging and detrimental to the Republican Party. And I think that, I don't know if you agree with me here, but I would suggest that the biggest media conglomerates in this country, and there's less of them than there used to be, tend to be on the left side. They tend to be liberal. ABC, CBS, CNN, NBC, the big players, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the big city papers, they tend to be left of center. I'm not saying they're way out there, but they're establishment left. And there are very few conservative outlets that are large, with the one exception of Fox. And, and talk radio is pretty conservative. But, I don't see this as, to my way of thinking, they control the high ground in the media.
Well, I am working on a book on the Democratic Party. So, and I will address the problems of what's sometimes called the mainstream media or the traditional media. But I certainly would concede that the right-wing media are vital to the Republican Party. They're very good at holding the base together, riling up the base, getting the base out to and that's a valuable asset for a party. But I do think that they also cut the party off from the middle. I think they make it hard for the party to reach out to the middle. And I'm thinking here less of Fox, actually, although I do think Fox is important. Fox is actually kind of moderate right.
Yeah, I agree with that.
For its position. You get into talk radio, and it's further to the right than Fox. And then some of the alt-right channels, even further to the right than that. They're not interested in moderation. They want their lawmakers to toe the line, stick to conservative principles, compromise be damned. Well, that doesn't work very well in our constitutional system. That's not the way the framers designed it to work. It's designed to work in the center. That's why we have all those checks and balances. You got to get people to compromise, accommodate, to get things done. And I think right-wing media make it hard for Republican lawmakers to kind of step outside where they stand to say, if we move a little bit, we might pick up the support we need to govern more effectively. And, there haven't been, Republicans have had a share of power for the last 10 years, controlled all the branches for 2 years. And then you try to look at the list of legislative accomplishments, and it's not a very long list. And in part, it's because they haven't moved very much or been willing to. And I think right-wing media, have been an anchor. It's also, I think, in right-wing media where you find the strongest kind of anti-immigrant sentiment. I don't want to play some clips, but some of the talk show hosts really treat Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans like they're not real Americans. Somehow they're not true Americans. Well, they are, and they vote. I think they make it hard for the party to reach out to those groups. Well, after the 2012 defeat, the Republican National Committee did an autopsy and said, we've got to reach out to women. We've got to reach out to young people. We've got to reach out to minorities. Well, a lot in the right-wing talk circuit wouldn't have it. And they said that would destroy America. They have an image of America that's largely a white America. And so I think it's destructive in that way. And then, one thing about talk radio, left or right, truth doesn't have a lot of traction. It's an
opinion medium. It's not a news medium.
It goes with the medium. And, it's as true of those on the left. There are fewer voices in left talk than there are in right talk. But boy, they play fast and loose with the facts. We saw that early on with the coronavirus, with Limbaugh going on and on about how this is nothing more than the seasonal flu, and Hannity going on.
Well,
and
Nancy Pelosi was saying the same thing. Let's be fair here.
Well, but not on and on.
In fact, she attacked Trump for saying, let's slow down the flights from China by saying that was racist.
Oh, sure.
And then she went to Chinatown and said, come on down and let's all have a party. But anyway, the thing is that you make the point that conservative talk, they have been somewhat purist, and I agree with that. Left talk is not as prevalent because there isn't as much of them. They don't have the kind of popularity that conservatives have, and that's an interesting subject right there. But my contention, however, is that these are all still minor players, and the big players in the media tend to be left of center, and they are. President Trump, I think, is quite right when he points out that they are treating him unfairly, in that there is this huge endeavor to try to take, not just to oppose him, like we would do in normal times when you have a loyal opposition and you criticize policies, or even not to dislike him, that's fine, but to literally take him out. I mean, I was getting, during the Mueller period, I was getting bulletins from the Boston Globe. I live in Boston. Oh my God, Stormy Daniels said something. I mean, I'm looking at this thing on my cell phone. I'm ready to have a nervous breakdown. You think something big is happening, and he's about to be indicted. It's imminent. It's imminent. Any minute now. And of course, it didn't happen. But the point is, I think he's right when he says it's unfair. It's the first time since in this presidency that you have major media outlets go out with a story that has one anonymous source. That's something that would have never been done before. The standards have gone way down. Even the New York Times, this whole business about the bounty hunters, it's been largely retracted now because it was like one anonymous source and it's been refuted. But they went out with that in a way that they would never have done in the past. It's very irresponsible, and it's bringing discredit to the media, but the problem is it has a huge impact.
Oh, I do think the standards have slipped. I don't.
Oh, absolutely, and all in the business of taking out Trump, not just opposing him on legitimate political questions, which is fine. I wish they would, but it's this kind of, trying to get him and with stories that turn out to be, and we could go through a long list of them that really turn out to be bogus, and that they float out there and then they disappear after a week and everyone forgets about it and they go on to the next one. And it's very unfair, and I think that it's lacking nuance. It's lacking. I've never seen a positive story about Trump since he's been elected in the mainstream media ever. I think Michael Smerconish, the radio talk show host in Philadelphia, who's actually slightly left of center, and he's a very good guy, very good host. He made a very mild comment during his program praising President Trump for something that he had done. And the hate mail that he got, the threats to his advertisers, the boycott threats, he had to retract it. He had to pull it back. I mean, he had advertisers who'd been with him for 30 years suddenly getting, boycott threats.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we have a heated system. You ask a lot of what I would call liberal columnists, they get hate mail by the bushelful now. So
Right.
I think hate is up right and left in America, sadly.
Sure.
But, I think what's interesting, though, is a good question is what's the baseline here that we're working off of? So if you go back to the 2016 campaign, and we did a really systematic content analysis of about a dozen major news outlets, including Fox. And in every one of them, Hillary Clinton, except for the LA Times, Hillary Clinton got more negative coverage than Donald Trump. In part because Donald Trump actually got very positive coverage early on. The media was very excited by
because they didn't think it was going to go anywhere. There was more of a sensation.
Right. And he dominated the message in 2016 as no candidate has, in part because he's good for ratings. So
yeah,
this is marketing as well. And if you try to think about what got a lot of airing in 2016, try to think about something about Hillary Clinton that she said, or with Donald Trump, lock her up. Crooked Hillary got tons of coverage. So, yeah, I think the press actually tends to go for the negative. They go for the conflict. What's different, I think, is somewhere this shifted with Donald Trump. And there I would agree with you. I think early on he was getting much the same treatment that politicians get, which is they beat the hell out of you regardless of whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. But I think they shifted over, and it's hard to know why, but I do think one reason they shifted over is, again, because he's a blunt instrument. It would have been one thing if he had, if he was like Ronald Reagan. Reagan didn't like the media either, but
right.
Reagan knew how to do it. Trump calls them lying media, fake media, enemy of the people. Someone calls you that for about 6 months, you say, well, to hell with you. We're going to take you down too. You're trying to take us down. And I think it's poisoned the well, to be honest with you, on both sides of the fence. I don't give him a free pass.
No, I understand. He doesn't handle it.
And I certainly don't give journalists a free pass for kind of departing from their norms and standards in their coverage of this president.
No, I mean, look, I think that there's something more systemic going on here in that there is a dislike of Trump's policies. They don't like the fact that he's not the usual internationalist, kind of globalist, kind of liberal guy that both the Bushes were and that certainly Obama and Clinton were. And they want to stop that because he's a populist, and it's a movement that's actually occurring around the world. It's not just in the United States. It's the Brexit movement. It's the protests in Hong Kong. We could look at different other venues where people are saying the established. It's kind of it's both anti-establishment, but it's also a reassertion of national sovereignty in a sense that other presidents have given this lip service, but Trump really does mean it. He wants to put the interests of this nation before all others, and he wants other nations to put their interests over others as well. And that threatens, I think, a certain very primal establishment, both liberal and conservative. And I think that's why they're going after him. I really think that if he was on the right side, he would be given a pass for all of these obnoxious and crude things he says. It would be, oh, he's a character. He's a colorful.
Well, I think we'll just disagree on that.
Okay.
I think you have a point about the agenda. I don't think you have, at least I don't have, the same opinion about how we expect a president to act and what standard we should ask from the highest official in the land. I do think that he's been pushing the edges of that from day one in office, and I think that's not been good for him, to be honest with you. I don't think it's been good for the presidency. So we can disagree about
That's fair
that.
enough.
But,
We could.
on the,
I would
policy
agree.
agenda side, I come closer to being in agreement with you. But,
Okay, because I think that I take a lot of issue with his personal style, but I don't think I think that would be overlooked if he was on the right side. Now, the other positions you have, the other traps you have, is that Republicans stand for tax cuts.
well, let me talk about that for a second, if I could, Charles.
By all means.
Until Donald Trump came along, the president, and we've been studying as scholars, we've been studying the coverage of presidents since roughly the 1960s in terms of the tone of their coverage, favorable or unfavorable. And until Donald Trump came along, the president who received the most unfavorable coverage was not another Republican. It happened to be Bill Clinton. And every quarter of his 8-year presidency, his coverage was negative on balance. And they went after him on just about everything, from Whitewater to Paula Jones to whatever. So, I think there was a style that Clinton had that grated on them as well. So I don't think it's simply being that he's got that style and he's a Republican. I think,
Right.
I think Bill Clinton is a prime example of, if you have a certain kind of style that doesn't fit the establishment image of a president, you're going to get hammered. But
I guess so. Although I think Clinton, even though he made some really great accomplishments, I think he was personally very corrupt, and they had to be called out on those things. But on the issue of the Republicans standing for tax cuts and money for the rich, I mean, I think that that's an economic question. And I think that when you have lower taxes and you leave more capital in the hands of the creators of capital, it stimulates the economy. It creates jobs. It creates investment. It creates consumer exchange, which helps small companies. So, I mean, I suppose it's the way you portray that. And to try to get into a paradigm of resentment for people who are successful, I guess younger people buy that, I suppose, but I'm not sure that's the reality of it.
so in that chapter of is the Republican Party destroying itself? I call that one the money trap. I'm not talking about the wisdom of the policy. I'm talking about the politics of the policy. And every one of these chapters is really about the politics of the Republican Party and the implications of the politics, not whether it's good policy or bad policy.
Right.
But the point I make in as a result of the Reagan, George W. Bush and Trump tax cuts, is that to some degree, the Republican Party has lost one of its best images. So if you go back to the 1970s and you asked Americans, when you think of the Republican Party, what do you think about? They would say, well, I think of the Republican Party as the party of the middle class. You ask them today what they think about the Republican Party, they say, I think the Republican Party is the party of the wealthy. I would, as a party, politically, I would much rather be seen as the party of the middle class than the party of the wealthy. The other point that I make in that chapter is that there was a group of Republicans that didn't like the 2017 tax cut bill. And they tended to be white working class Republicans. The kind of the marketplace Republicans, the more conventional Republicans, they were very supportive of the tax cut. White working class Republicans were not. I think there's a possibility of a split there. And my point is, I think politically, I think the Republicans have put themselves in a bit of a bind. Biden said either last week or the week before, he was talking to a group of fairly wealthy potential donors to his campaign. And he said, if I win, I'm going to pass some tax policies that you're not going to like very much. And I have no question that if the Democrats take the presidency, somehow squeak by and also take the Senate, I think it's pretty clear they're going to hold on to the House. One of the first things they're going to do is put in the hopper in Congress a tax cut bill for the middle class that's going to be paid for by an increase on taxes on upper incomes. And I think that's going to put Republican lawmakers in a bind. If they vote against that bill, then they're going to be portrayed as enemies of the middle class. If they vote for it, they're going to make some enemies among their donor class. So I think they painted themselves into a corner by just kind of taking it one step too far. The George W. Bush tax cut was popular across the board. A majority of Americans opposed the Trump tax cut in part because it didn't have the economic stimulus justification that Reagan used, George W. Bush used. We were on the largest upswing economically in the country's history. So why do we need to prime the pump by providing more of a supply side stimulus? I think it was an ill-advised tax cut bill. That's my opinion politically.
Right.
Whether it was good.
Whether it's good economically is another question, but you're right. I mean, a lot of this is the image and the political rhetoric that people accept that somehow the Republicans are the party of the rich, when in fact, the top 1% Americans are overwhelmingly on the Democratic side, and they're the richest. There's one exception. If you look at the Forbes magazine, they publish the top 100 richest Americans every year. Of the top 10, there's only 2 that are not Democrats, and those are the Koch brothers. And then if you go down the list, the further down you go, you start seeing a few Republicans, but they're mostly liberals and mostly Democrats who hold the large wealth. But yet the Republicans are portrayed somehow as being the party of the rich, and I don't think they are. I think they're the party of blue-collar workers, party of people coming up in employment, and they should be the party of minorities and millennials. They're not, because they don't know how to describe who they are. It's a matter of communication. But that brings me to your final trap, which is voter suppression. I don't think that there is voter suppression. I think that it's reasonable to develop a system by which someone shows ID when they vote, as long as it doesn't cost them anything to do so. And I don't understand. I've never really understood why it is that this is supposedly a voter suppression of minorities. I mean, minorities, it's almost insulting to minorities to suggest that they don't have ID. I mean, everyone has to have ID to go to a grocery store or to buy a pack of cigarettes or whatever it is. And I just don't get that. I mean, I think that there's a lot of smoke on that one, a lot of rhetoric.
Well, there have been some good studies about who doesn't have a voter ID, government issued voter ID, and
well, a license. I mean, it's not
it's
a
the
matter
case
of a
that 25% of Black Americans do not have one of those forms of ID.
Well, I don't have one either. I mean, but the thing is that in most states, you just need to show your license, or you need to show. I mean, there's a way to do this, and most people have ID. I mean, including most minorities. I mean, I don't get. I mean, it's almost like it seems to me to be kind of patronizing. Let's just put it that way, to suggest that minorities don't have proper ID, because it can be done, and it can be done easily, and it can be done without any cost in terms of identifying yourself. You don't have to have a special ID. I mean, I've never even been asked to show an ID at the voting polls, but I identify myself by giving my address, and they check it off. There has to be a means by which we can identify the voter. There has to be a protection of our system of one man, one vote. I mean, I just think that that shouldn't be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be a political issue. And I suspect the reason it is a partisan issue is because the Democrats cheat.
Well, show me some evidence for that, Charles. So, but
I could, but it's too much of a show.
The way to fix it would be the way Europeans do it, and that's to have all the states and local jurisdictions take responsibility for putting every citizen on the voter rolls, and they do it that way, and we don't. We put the burden on the individual, and if you don't have one of those voter ID things, it's not that easy in certain parts of the country.
Well, it should be easy. I agree with you on that, and it can be easy. And also, if they're going to be putting everyone on the voter rolls, they should also take people off the voter rolls who have moved on to other states or to have passed away.
Oh, sure. No. I think we need to clean up our election machinery. I mean, I'm with you on that. But, let me give you a couple of examples that strike me as, boy, what's going on here? One was the 2017 bill that the Republican legislature in North Dakota passed that said to register to vote, you have to have a street name and number as your address.
I think that's Massachusetts has that.
Who doesn't have that in North Dakota?
People that I don't know, Native Americans, maybe?
Native Americans.
All right, well, that's a problem.
The reservations, a lot of the tribal roads don't have names and numbers.
Okay.
That's a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise the Native Americans who vote about 3-1 Democratic. So it wasn't.
I think that's a point well taken, and voting is a local thing. It's a precinct thing. Yeah. We know that in the 2012 election, Barack Obama got more than 100% of the vote in certain precincts, particularly in Detroit. So there is voter fraud, but that's a whole different subject for another day.
Yeah.
Thomas Patterson, I want to thank you for joining me this afternoon. It's very interesting talk. The book is the Republican Party Destroying Itself? You are a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government, what locally we like to call Camelot High School, just a local. And thanks so much, Thomas, for joining me today.
Oh, Charles, my pleasure. You take care. Be safe.
You too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good afternoon.
Yeah, you too.